He's looking at religion through a psychological lens, a sociological lens, literary lens. He seemed to explain the phenomena that I had been through. Without having to chalk it up to some sort of supernatural deity, we can negotiate it, and that we don't have to hold to these very dogmatic positions about the world.
Most of the biggest philosophical arguments for God, things like contingency argument, cosmological argument, the moral argument, all of these get to this idea of God, which is totally opposite of what Peterson believes, which is a God who is fundamental to the universe.
He does the liberal deconstruction philosophy, then appropriates conservative language, and then seems to only associate with conservatives.
What were the things that led to deconstruct and then eventually leave the faith?
Deconstruction and leaving are two different things. And I've seen some people leave without deconstructing, where they will leave a religion, and now their ideas are just the inverse. And those, I think, are a sign of you've left, but you're still being controlled by it.
Welcome to Truth and Tradition. In this episode, I'm speaking with YouTuber and podcaster Cade Bradly. Cade has had a couple appearances on the YouTube channel Jubilee, and most recently he spoke with Dr. Jordan Peterson about the existence of God. Despite Peterson's public defense of the Christian God, Cade credits Dr. Peterson's work for turning him into an atheist.
Jordan Peterson, I credit to turning me into an atheist.
This conversation covers deconstruction, homosexuality, and religion as an expression within the human psyche. If you enjoy these podcasts, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Let's get into it. Well, Cade, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me here.
You mentioned in Jubilee video, you said that Jordan Peterson, I credit to turning me into an atheist. Can you unwrap what you mean by this?
When I was very Catholic, I thought that all of the benefits and the phenomena of religion had to be supernatural because there was no possible explanation for the peace, for the relief from the sacraments, for the sense of meaning in this world, those deeply emotional elements of religion. I thought that because they were so profound and there was no way to explain them naturally, it means that they had to be supernatural, and that those experiences were proof of the fact that the supernatural had ordained this particular religion. But what I found with Peterson is that he seemed to offer a really solid explanation of religion, the phenomena, the benefits, the downsides, the thought patterns, the archetypes, all of this, without having to appeal to the supernatural. He's looking at religion through a psychological lens, a sociological lens, a literary lens. All of these things, he seemed to explain the phenomena that I had been through, without having to chalk it up to some sort of supernatural deity. And so once I realized that, hey, religion is natural, well, if religion is created or religion is negotiated, it means that we can negotiate it and that we don't have to hold to these very dogmatic positions about the world.
I see. You said that you were experiencing these kind of things that you defined as only explained through spiritual phenomena. What are these things? What would you say were these experiences? Question. Do you use TikTok? Well, if you don't, you should, because you can now find Truth and Tradition on TikTok. I'll be posting all of my shorts and going live on TikTok, so give it a follow and share it with anyone you think might enjoy the content. That's Truth_Tradition on TikTok. You don't want to miss it, and I'll see you right over there.
I put it this way: for a lot of Protestant viewers, they might be familiar with Cry Night on a retreat, where you have the music, you have everything that's happening, and people have this experiencing Jesus moment at, let's say, a Protestant summer camp.
Yep.
The Catholic equivalent of that is adoration, where you have the Eucharist, which is the piece of bread that's said to be Jesus, in a monstrance, which is this very flashy, ornate, gold-like case. And then you have these times where everybody's singing, and it's dark, and it's candlelit, and everybody's looking towards the monstrance, looking towards Jesus in the Eucharist, and you're filled with peace. And you feel like he's talking to you, and all of your problems in the world kind of melt away, and you have this beautiful moment in which Jesus is said to be with his people. And that's how Catholics like to pitch the Eucharist. So our God isn't somebody out there. Our God didn't just come 2,000 years ago. He's present physically here. And so with the Mass on weekends was this like representation of the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary, where heaven and earth meet in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. All of these like poetic, beautiful things, and then the experience derived therefrom. I was like, wow, like this is true. And then as I was listening to Peterson, has in Maps of Meaning, has a passage on the Eucharist and the symbolic representation. And I realized like the statement, the Mass is where heaven and earth meet, and it is this communion of the divine, this spousal love. Like that is what makes it meaningful. Like that statement is what produces this sort of emotional reaction inside of you. The idea of like Jesus being present with you, it's that idea that gives you peace. It's not that you have some epistemic access to the reality and the ontological and metaphysical nature of this particular piece of bread. It's that, yeah, if you tell people that this is God and God loves you and God is there in the silence with you, like, of course people are going to think that. And I think what I've learned since becoming an atheist is that like I can appreciate religion, I can investigate religion, I can chalk good and bad things up to it, I can investigate the phenomena and say that like this has a real impact on people's lives, without having to go like, well, what is it that God wants? And like, what is the correct religion? I can go, well, we can investigate these questions from an academic perspective and be happy for people. And it doesn't mean we have to stop believing. It just means that we don't have to believe in the way that the Catholic Church says that we have to believe. I run ultramarathons, which are long distance races. And one race that's always been on my radar is the Moab 240 that I'm doing this year. It's a big 240-mile race out in the middle of Moab. And the trails are publicly accessible. Like I could go there today and run those sections of the trail. Or during the actual race itself, I could take quadruple the time and sleep at night and like come back to the town and sleep in a bed and not run for 110 hours straight. But what makes it special is that like it's something that inspires me. Like the idea like, can I run 240 miles? Like that's something that I've thought about. Like who is it that I might become by that journey? What is it that I have to train for? Who will I become? And then there's all these archetypes where I've heard about it from years. I've heard the horror stories and I've heard the triumphant stories and I've heard what techniques work and what techniques don't work. And I've seen people, and I've been there to volunteer and seen people cross the finish line. And the finish line's just an arch in the middle of a campground. There's nothing like about that arch and that location that is inaccessible to the general public. I could start that race, leave, and then drive and then cross the finish line again. Like it's not the location of it that makes it special. It's that there's this challenge that's out there. There's these archetypes and this idea that's in my head. And during the actual event, the course is arbitrary in the sense that like you can go a number of different directions and those trails are publicly accessible. But it's something about this format where there's social groups around it. There's these archetypes, there's these ideas that this is something special because we've constructed it. And I think that recognizing religion as something natural doesn't make religion less valuable. And I think in a certain sense, it makes it more valuable because we choose to believe it. That it is something sacred and special to us, that we have constructed it, we have negotiated it, and it's something that we want to be a part of. And the same thing with this race, like I said, I could go there next week, but it wouldn't have this significance to it, that there is a ritual to the race, there are rules to the race, there is social recognition thereof. And that's what makes it special and something that's been on my bucket list for years.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The idea of almost connecting it to a purposeful goal and connecting it to a story as well. You threw around the word archetype. I think a lot of people hear this, especially growing up in like schools, in reference to literary devices, but archetype is probably a little bit bigger than that. Can you explain, what do you mean when you say archetype?
Yeah, so an archetype can mean a lot of different things. For somebody like Jordan Peterson, these archetypes or these common story arcs that are present in the human condition are sort of endemic and universal, where a Jungian analysis is going to say like these archetypes are present in all of us. But what I think an archetype is are the heroes that we look up to, both good and bad. It's how we filter information. It's how we make moral decision making. A lot of the writings of Homer or the Odyssey or the Iliad, like in ancient Greek culture, there were archetypes. When somebody was making a decision, they would relate it back to, well, Odysseus did this, or this particular story of a god did that. whether it's
What
Medusa
would
or the
Jesus do,
sirens.
right?
Yeah, what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
And to that point, like Jesus is a tremendous archetype, and that Christians somehow relate suffering in their life to this is just like when Jesus was on the cross,
Mm.
or when they see somebody being persecuted, it's just like the early church, and Jesus said this particular verse about, well, first the world's going to hate you. Or in the case of ultramarathons, there are a number of different runners, and there's people that have inspired me, and that when I'm at a dark moment in a race, I think of like, well, this particular runner has crushed this, and he said in his darkest moment, he got out of it by doing this. Like they're the stories that we tell ourselves about our success or our failure, about where we should or shouldn't go, that we pull from to make life decisions.
Mm. So, does the fact that it's a story we tell ourselves in order to benefit from it, that doesn't necessarily make the story like ontologically false,
Mhm.
but in a sense, it shows us why telling the story is beneficial. So, I guess what brings you from seeing that as a real event to seeing that as a story you tell yourself in order to have some sort of benefit from?
And I think that's what I talk about in the video with Peterson, is that I thought that it was literally true, that the Eucharist was literally this bread from heaven, that these rituals were literally happening, and so that brought such tremendous meaning. But once I
Mhm.
understood what archetypes were, what these like stories of who we are and where we're going were, I realized that like, oh, everything that I feel about this ritual doesn't necessarily like imbue or reflect an objective reality about it. And then once you realize like, hey, this is constructed, like I said, then you get to negotiate it. Where a lot of people recognize what Peterson says, or these idea of archetypes or natural or religion being a natural phenomena, and stay religious. And I know a number of progressive Christians who use Peterson's framework to stay religious. Because in the same way that like I've chosen the own archetypes I have around running, somebody can still say thoroughly Christian and hold to those archetypes without having to say that, you know, we have an exclusive or a monopolized view of truth, or that nobody else can go to heaven apart from our particular religion.
Mhm.
Like I said, to recognize the natural origins isn't to say that it's meaningful, or to say that it's not meaningful, is not to say that it's dumb or that it's somehow a reflection of not being smart or being duped into something. I think regardless of what religion we're a part of, we all have archetypes and meta narratives and rituals that are out there. But the question becomes, now we can actually investigate them, and we can make sure that these stories serve us versus us serving these stories. And for example, on
Mm.
homosexuality in the Catholic Church, there's these archetypes of these like ex-gay or former gay individuals that are on these stories of, well, I used to live the gay lifestyle and I found it unfulfilling, and now Christ has perfectly fulfilled me. I can go, cool. Like, I don't dispute what you're saying. And I can go, and also I can have a different experience because it's natural. Or I can look at those stories, I can look at the opposite stories, and I can go, what are the ones that I find inspiring or the ones that I want to follow? Because we're all going to follow some of these archetypes. But I think what I find Peterson's more recent work or from religious fundamentalists is that, well, you have to accept these archetypes and these ideas and these axioms and these cognitive processes, or else there's hell. I think it's just
Mm.
these things are. And now we get to negotiate with them and figure out what makes society the best that we can have.
I guess there's this idea of there are multiple archetypes, so almost like there's multiple paths to the same destination, I think is an analogy that's often presented. And so when you present your archetype and say that it is the only way, then it almost gaslights other archetypes and says they aren't true. They're not only maybe they aren't ontologically true, but they actually just they don't work.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where you see the friction and why you would maybe reject certain archetypes. Is that kind of what I'm hearing from you, or let me know if I'm
Yeah.
wrong.
No, and that's exactly what Peterson says throughout his works, where when Peterson talks about Christian archetypes, it's not because he thinks these like literally happened. What he sees with archetypes is that the ones that are replicated and the ones that produce the best fruits are what he means by true. versus the sort of like going back in time with a video camera is a separate question from like, what are the impacts on society of particular archetypes and axioms and ideas that we promulgate in a society? And so when Peterson props up Christianity, it's not because he thinks they are objectively or ontologically true, but rather a sort of like bulwark against the world of relativism or postmodernism, which is an ironic thing for him to criticize somebody of. But I think in all of our archetypes and in every culture, we're going to have them. But I think that when we are so inspired by an idea that it becomes beyond reproach and that it becomes applied and grafted onto every future society, even when things change, now we are serving the stories instead of the stories serving us. Like I think about raising kids. Like you don't tell them about every archetype that's ever existed. You kind of go like, what are the lessons and the ideas that I want my children to have so they can flourish, right? I might tell them archetypes of the kids who steal always get caught. And then that way, when the kids are looking at doing something bad, they think like, well, I know from every story that I've heard that it's just better to be truthful. Like you probably wouldn't tell your kid the story of like, oh, look at all these con men who've gotten away with things if they just lie well enough. Where like you pick and choose the archetypes that you want to imbue your kids with. And it's not like these are wholesale constructions and like contrary to some ontological reality. But I think there's a lot of archetypes, and so we get to decide what are the ones that we want to promulgate inside of a culture.
But how do we determine which archetypes are what we would call wrong or right? Like where does that come from? We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, do you like coffee? I sure do. In fact, most days coffee is the very thing that provides me with the energy to get these episodes out to all of you. If you enjoy these podcasts and would like to support the channel, you can send me a tip at buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition. Also linked in the description down below. Here you can send me a one-time or reoccurring gift if you really love me. Let's keep things PG. You can also send me a custom message, which is greatly appreciated. That's buymeacoffee.com/truth_tradition or the link in the description down below. Cheers.
I think our castigation of particular archetypes is what it means for them to be wrong. It's not that we throw these archetypes to the side and then they are imbued with wrongness. I think right or wrongness is the endeavor in which we are pulling things forward and pushing things to the side. So I don't think that we're trying to like discern or uncover some sort of fundamental reality about these stories. I think the language of right or wrong is precisely the endeavor that we're partaking in. Not that the endeavor then like imbues it with wrongness, but wrongness is what we mean by, or when we say something is wrong, what we mean by it is we don't want to promulgate it in a society. So that like throwing aside and saying wrong are the same act, and saying something is right and promulgating it are the same acts versus kind of like a two-step or ontological truth claim about them. Where he talks about like with mice, like when they wrestle in labs, they have to fake lose in order to like keep the game going. That as they go through iterations, rats of different strength play a game. And those games and those rules are iterated and improved upon. And the games and what it means for an idea to be true is that in a certain sense, it's self-sustaining, it's promulgating, it's widespread, and can kind of stay stable. And so what he sees with authoritarian regimes on both with fascism and with communism is that when he says that they're wrong, what he means is that they self-implode, that they don't lead to good fruits, that they don't sustain themselves because they don't play, and thus they can't iterate, and thus they can't generate or propagate over time. And so a lot of the times he'll wrap it in much more Christian terms or much more objective terms. But ultimately what Peterson looks at isn't this sort of like ontological reality, but rather this sort of like ease of propagation. And that's what he means by true. Even when he talks about biblical texts, he doesn't see like a historical critical approach trying to like approximate what the authors intended as the way to interpret scripture, both with his AI endeavors and how he talks about scripture. He talks about propagation and citations and like or generation and propagation over time and sustainability as what it means to interpret scripture versus investigating what did the 1st century or the 5th century before Christ authors intend. So when he talks about interpretation and all of these grand ideas, he's fundamentally some sort of nihilist atheist who likes to appropriate a lot of Christian terms so as to purposely excite the ideas and passions of Christians and make a little bit of cash in the meantime. And a lot of millions of dollars of cash.
Yeah. I guess it does get to why he sort of is pretty dodgy at times, especially when people are starting to nail down is this actually what happened in reality? Like, is this truly what actually happened historically, I guess? And I think it was Alex O'Connor who kind of got him to the point which you referenced, the video camera on the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Would we see the tomb empty? And I think he says something along the lines of,
I would suspect so.
I would suspect so, which is kind of like, oh, come on. Like, yeah.
I think ultimately it's still a dodge in that situation, because a lot of people took it like, he believes in Jesus. And the answer is like, all he said is that he would suspect the tomb would be empty. He didn't say anything about dying. He didn't talk anything about crucifixion. He didn't talk about sonship.
Maybe the
with
body
the Father.
Was stolen. Or
All he said is that somebody would have walked out of there, which once again, Peterson isn't dumb. Like, he's aware of how things get interpreted. But he makes a lot of money by being particularly obtuse in a way that is commonly taken in a way that he didn't actually intend. I think one of the most telling clips about Peterson is he was asked at an event, if humanity ceased to exist, would God still exist? Which to your average Christian who kind of like sees an ontological or metaphysical realm would be like a really easy question, right? God existed before time, space, and matter, before humanity. And if the universe was wiped out of existence, God would still be this all-powerful sort of entity. But Peterson seemed to waffle over the question, wasn't sure how to answer the question. And by virtue of him being unsure about the question means he does not believe in the way that the average Christian believes.
Do you think that if all humanity were to cease to exist, does God still exist?
I don't think I know how to answer that. It's just the situation is too hypothetical. I mean, I can take a crack at some of it. There are lots of elements of being that would disappear if we disappeared. I think that reality is an interaction between what we perceive of as the material substrate and consciousness itself. And so then when you destroy consciousness, you destroy reality. And what that leaves, I don't really understand. So lots vanishes without human consciousness and self-consciousness.
Isn't exactly a sort of purposeful building of like an ontological nature, but that like we project God or the supernatural onto the world with our psyches, and that God would cease to exist without our psyches. So in some way is generated from us and negotiated with us. And so when Peterson talks about the archetypes of Jesus and biblical interpretation, all of these big things that like Christians love him for, and he gets invited to all of these Christian universities. And at the end of the day, he's deliberately choosing words and knows how people interpret those words to be, and is okay with people wildly misinterpreting them. For example, on the episode that I did on Jubilee, when I said my background's in is in studying to become a Catholic priest, a lot of people interpreted that to be like I was some high-ranking seminarian, which is not true. And so part of the responsibility is like, oh, so when I say a phrase like that, people interpret it to mean I was high up in a seminary. That's not true. So I kind of have this responsibility where like I know how that sounds. I know now how that's interpreted. And so I'm going to change words differently because the statement is true, right? My background's in studying to become a Catholic priest. But now I know how people take that. And it'd be like, well, if everybody's saying I was a seminarian, if I kept this like vague idea and never clarified what I really was, is what I mean, where Peterson's just kind of like, people have interpreted it one way, he keeps like fanning the flames and still maintains this sort of like plausible deniability, but he knows what people are interpreting it to mean and has built a career off of essentially people misinterpreting his work, or misinterpreting is a strong term, people utilizing his work in a way that he does not himself believe.
Yeah, it's convenient.
Yeah.
It's a beneficial thing for him to not be super clear. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow, that's super fascinating. You mentioned the idea also earlier that in Peterson's concept of God, God would not exist without us in a sense. And the crazy thing when it comes to that is most of the biggest like philosophical arguments for God, things like the contingency argument or the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument, all of these get to this idea of God, which is totally opposite of what Peterson believes, which is a God who is fundamental to the universe. There is no universe, there is no human beings, there is nothing unless there is a God. And yet, Peterson's God does not exist in that realm at all, but instead, he's more of a contingent truth. His God is contingent upon us humans. It's not a necessary truth, it's contingent. Just like the fact that I'm wearing, this shirt today is contingent upon the fact that I chose to wear this shirt today. I thought it looked nice, right? God is contingent upon human beings having motivation.
It's in a certain sense like political parties. Like political parties are
Mm.
real. Political parties are impactful. But like the idea of Democrats or Republicans in their 2025 form aren't like pre-existent ideas and like
Yeah.
independent ideas. They're like real forces in the world. And they're like true things that exist, right? Like the Republican National Convention is like a thing that happens in reality, and same thing with the Democratic National Convention. But the concepts in of themselves will cease to exist upon the heat death of the universe or the collapse of one of the parties. Like they are real. We can interact with them. They are objectively existing, but they don't exist outside of our imaginations, outside of our projected consciousness. And that's where I find the weird thing with Peterson, where a lot of his concepts are stuff that you'd hear at like liberal seminaries, right? Did like Jesus really exist and like die for sins? Like that's the stuff you see at like woke feminist seminary with like the giant pride flag up front, right? And which is like awesome. And like those are great conversations. My really only problem with Peterson is that like he does the liberal deconstruction like philosophy, then like appropriates conservative language, and then seems to only associate with conservatives. Where his frameworks help me broaden my ideas of what religion and what spirituality can be, has helped me become more accepting of different religions that are out there and different spiritualities or lack thereof or cognitive processes. Like it has expanded my horizons. And if Peterson, all he did was like talk about these concepts and interview people all across this phenomena of religion, it would be like congruent. But it's this weird, like he's trying to import and then mask these liberal ideas and then used it as a tool to only propagate dogma and conservatism.
On one hand, what he's propagating, these ideas are beautiful and they're really great and they're really helpful. And I'm sure they were like, it sounds like it was really helpful for you in your deconstruction process. But the heart behind why he's propagating these ideas is for his own material benefit. And he kind of disguises these ideas in something that is totally different than what they actually are. But he does so for material benefit. At least that's what it seems to be. So I can see why that would be very frustrating. So
and it's a sort of like Mott and Bailey bit where he'll like push for conservatism, and then when you like ask him why, then he like switches modes, and then when you're like, awesome, we're on this mode, then he like switches back to this other side, where you would expect somebody of his caliber to be talking about the kalam or the contingency or the moral arguments or hold scripture to be inerrant or some sort of like, these are the lines in the sand. But in a weird way, Peterson's like a Newtonian fluid where like he's liquid and then he like lashes out and becomes solid. And then upon investigation of that like lashing out, then he goes back into being a liquid. And so he's impossible to talk to or debate, because once you like engage him on a proposition, the proposition has so drastically changed that you're no longer arguing with that. And then the episode's done, and then he goes back to doing this original thing. It's this sort of like playing whack-a-mole with what he's up to, because what he talks about and how he gets there are two different things that he can oscillate between, so that he's never trapped down.
I want to shift the conversation to discussing a little bit more about this idea of deconstruction itself.
Mhm.
This word is thrown out so often, and it has somewhat to do with like an intellectual pursuit. It has another thing to do with like losing a past persona, and it's a whole life altering process that a lot of people, especially here in the West, are saying that they're going through. What is this thing that people say is deconstruction? What are they referring to when they say that?
I think there's a caricature of deconstruction from people still part of religion, that deconstruction is destruction of everything. That you have a wall of
Mhm.
beliefs, and that when somebody's deconstruction, they just take a giant weight to it and destroy the wall. And every Christian belief that they had beforehand is now gone and inverted. But what I think deconstruction really is to first identify and then evaluate the beliefs that we have. I don't think destruction or deconstruction leads you to a particular school of thought. I don't think that to deconstruct means to leave religion or to leave the group that you're a part of. I think the first step of deconstruction is to just identify what are the beliefs that I have. And especially if you've been raised in a religion, the axioms and the archetypes and the concepts and assumptions you have about the world are so ingrained in you that you're not even aware that you have those axioms. And so when you start looking at the broader world, you get to figure out like, oh, so like I was told this about suffering. That's interesting. I thought everybody thought that. And then you like look at the world and you're like, wait, there's a lot of different ideas around suffering and what to push through and what not to push through and pain and all of these concepts. And so the first step is to just go like, okay, so this is what I've been taught about this thing. And then evaluation is to go like, do I want to keep it? Do I want to reconfigure it? Do I want to throw it away entirely? And so it's almost like you look at this brick wall of ideas or the shelf of books on the library, and you pull them out one at a time and you read them. And then you figure out, do I want to put it back on the shelf or not? And I think deconstruction and leaving are two different things. And I've seen some people leave without deconstructing, where they will leave a religion and now their ideas are just the inverse. Whatever they thought before, their new ideas are the opposite, which you're still being controlled by the same apparatus because you're just being defined in opposition to. And so you see some people that'll go from hard left to hard right, or they go from very religious to I want to burn everything down. And those I think are a sign of like you've left, but you're still being controlled by it. Where the only way, or like I don't think that any religion or any belief system is entirely wrong on everything. That statistically speaking, some of the ideas that you were raised with are the ones that you're going to keep, and that might be good ideas. And so the key is to like drain the bathtub without throwing out the baby. And so for some people, they stay part of their religious group and they just kind of have a new critical lens that they can throw on things, that they can go to church and they can listen to the sermons and they can also support gay rights. Or in the opposite direction, they might go to a different church or a different religion altogether as part of deconstruction. For some people like myself, that means leaving religion entirely. That deconstruction and destruction are not fundamentally the same thing.
You made a really good point in there too that I've been exploring and thinking about a lot, which is the idea of when you sort of deconstruct something, there's a tendency in that process to just be the anti whatever that was, like anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, anti, what have you. There's even people within Christianity that I know of that are anti whatever different denomination they were. So there's, Baptists who were once Pentecostals, and they're like, oh no, I don't believe in, I'm a cessationist now. I don't believe in the works of the Holy Spirit happening to this day anymore. But what I find to be maybe a healthier approach is to deconstruct what doesn't seem to make sense anymore. What puzzle pieces don't seem to fit anymore, and then reconstruct what you still agree with or what you agree with now, what you are for. I think there's a lot of power and a lot of benefit in not being against something only, but in being for something. There's a lot of positive things to that. And so to me, when you were saying that, it's very important to assess, okay, I'm leaving this, but what am I for? I'm not just against this, I'm for something. So what is that? I need to figure that out. Yeah.
And I think that's where oftentimes religion can be a very effective like conversion tool where people go from atheist in culture, some sort of life that they are unhappy with. And then they see religion where like religion is obviously condemns things, but any religion's going to have like the set of principles that you live by, the 5 pillars of Islam, or the various things that are enumerated in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or Protestant ideas around discipleship. Like a lot of times what people find in religion is that it does like provide a positive framework for the world. Now, often sometimes those can be harmful. Sometimes those can get too far into condemning the other side. But religion can be a great self-help tool because it proposes. The lackiness of atheism, and I think what a lot of people as they're deconstructing, is that like atheism definitionally isn't a worldview. It's not positing anything. And so I think a lot of people say like, well, if I deconstruct, I don't have like a worldview. And it's like, well, yeah, because like we're not promising in atheism like there is the atheist worldview. There are so many different non-theistic worldviews out there. If you talk to academic philosophers or academic ethicists or people that are into spirituality or religion, that like deconstructing and let's say leaving behind some beliefs is the starting line. Like it is not at the ending line. It is not proposing a self-help model. It's just saying like, hey man, maybe I'm just not convinced of this other person's conception of God. And then it goes, and then there's so many other options to do there. But I think some people as they're deconstructing are like, what do I do instead? And then you go like, that's a great question. Like, let's go on the journey. Like we don't have like the book of answers. Like you have to go out there and find them. And what I found leaving religion for myself and seeing people leave altogether is that their muscle in their brain of like thinking for themselves and being okay with not having answers is very underdeveloped. Because in religion, it's like, what is the point of life? Boom, we got an answer. Where do we go after we die? We have an answer. What things are or aren't sinful? We have an answer. What is sin? We have an answer. Like so much, I think of religion as like these very easy answers to big, complex questions. And I think the thing that I've had to develop since leaving is like, hey, like maybe I don't have absolute certainty. Maybe I don't have perfect definitions of everything. Maybe a lot of these questions are big questions with really complicated answers that we're still trying to figure out. And that's okay. And like the ideas that I have now, I hope that they change. I hope that when I'm 50, I don't have the same ideas that I have at 22. I hope that my ideas on religion and spirituality and life and meaning, I hope that all of those update, and I'm actively working towards them updating. So it's a very different perspective shift where it's not like, what is the ontological reality of this thing about the meaning of life? It's like, let's start that journey of figuring that out. And it's such a different emotional state to be okay sitting in big questions without very simple solutions.
And you can do that as a religious person, because I know people who are religious who are okay with not having the answers to every single question. But I think you're right. It can be a cop-out when you are religious to just say, oh, well, we know all the answers and, you know, there's no nuance here. And so it's, you never, like you said, become comfortable with the, I don't know, the unknown idea behind things. Before we get deeper into deconstruction, I'd love to hear your story. What were the things that led to, first and foremost, you being devoted to Catholicism? Because I think that's just as important as the things that maybe led you away from it. So first off, what led you to Catholicism? What were those experiences? And then second, what were the experiences that had you start to deconstruct and then eventually leave the faith?
Yeah, so I was raised in the liberal suburbs of Minneapolis in kind of like a culturally Catholic household. A lot of people call it like moralistic therapeutic deism, and where God was this kind of loving force that people of different religions got to the same place, and God is provides this moral framework and this sort of like comfort in the afterlife. And so I went to church most weekends growing up at the local Catholic church, but we weren't exclusive about our claim to truth or condemning other religions or saw this in a dogmatic way. much more of a cultural way, a spiritual way. And then as I got into middle school and early high school, I was just having trouble making friends, finding my place in the world, dealing with my sexuality. There's so many things at my 7th and 8th grade self was like thinking about these big questions. And then I started attending my my church's local youth group, doing sort of some confirmation prep. And while I was there, I started making friends for the first time. I was given answers to these like big questions that I was trying to deal with, and they seemed convincing. And I think the Catholic intellectual tradition is a particularly ornate one, where I have my bookshelf of all of these definitions of sexuality and what is humanity and what is redemption and what is God's plan for the world. Like you have the catechism behind you there on that shot, and it's just definitions and this like systematic worldview, which to somebody who I like certainty, I like definitions, I like things fitting into neat boxes in my brain. It's like the Catholic Church gave me that perfectly. And so I got into apologetics, where I thought that I could like prove the faith, that it's not just I have faith and I think that like the Catholic Church is helpful, which it was to me, but that like we could prove these things from first principles with the 5 proofs for the existence of God, of looking at the historical evidence for Christ, of looking at the New Testament evidence for Christ establishing a church, for that church over time being this great apparatus and arbiter of truth that can make pronouncements. Like I was fully into apologetics and thought I could prove this thing. And then as I got older, I was just learning to become a priest, visiting a number of different seminaries, wanted to join this Carmelite order and become a cloistered monk for the rest of my life. They ended up rejecting me for experiencing same-sex attraction, because at that time I knew that I was attracted to men. I wasn't acting on it. I didn't have like some crazy double life, but the Catholic Church provided me this perfect way where I could go, you know, I'm same-sex attracted, but I don't have to let that define me. And I can just like pursue religion, and I don't even have to tell anybody. And I also don't have to like conversion therapy myself. It's kind of this like perfect out without having to deal with the issues at hand. And so after I was rejected from this religious order, I ended up going out to college to study theology and philosophy at this conservative Catholic university. I ended up
so they rejected you because of the same-sex attraction or because of affirming? In a Christian worldview, that's a very important distinction. Was it because of same-sex attraction or because you have affirmed it within yourself?
It was specifically for being attracted to members of the same sex. Because in Catholicism, like you can be attracted to men, you just can't act on it. You can't like claim that as your identity. You can't make that a big centerpiece of your identity. Right? Your experiences aren't your identity. And so in this framework, I'd filled out dozens of pages of documents. We were going through the application process. And one of the final documents was a checklist of like, do you have a history of drug use? No. Do you have a history of acting out sexually? No. Do you experience attractions to members of the same sex? Yes. Do you have DUIs in your past? No. Like it was kind of like the final document, and within 24 hours, it was like, you don't have a vocation.
You just checked the wrong thing, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm glad that I was honest, because it saved me from a lifetime of being there. But still, it was this deeply traumatic thing where they were told me, like, I don't have a vocation to be a priest anywhere. Not just with their order, but like being attracted and in celibate, but being attracted to members of the same sex was grounds that I could never have a vocation within the church. So I was like, wow, I guess like I'm going to go study and do whatever I do for the rest of my life. And so I was out at university, still thoroughly Catholic, going to the Latin Mass all the time, still thinking that I could prove the faith. And then I dropped out of college for unrelated business reasons. I run a production company. And so I dropped out to pursue that. And then I was looking at the rest of my life and like what the Catholic Church asks of me, which is mandatory celibacy or marrying a woman. And not just that like we tentatively think that, but like we know for certain that you can never do that. And this teaching will never change. And you can't even fall in love with somebody of the same sex. Like that is a big barrier, or that is a big barrier or a big proposition. So it's like, I feel like the evidence should match that, right? Like we should believe things in proportion to the evidence. And so as I looked at that issue, I was like, the Catholic Church has arguments, right? They can make arguments, but they're kind of weak. Like best case scenario is like, well, maybe something about teleology, and it should be kind of like, I don't know, not super socially propagated. It's like the best that they could do. But to like make it a mandatory thing for the rest of your life, that is a huge claim. And then I was going through back all of these apologetics, all of these talks, all of this philosophy, and going like, do Catholic ideas match up to the level of belief that we have to hold about them? Like Mary's perpetual virginity. Like, yeah, you can make kind of a half-baked scriptural argument, but it's not apparent unless you just go, well, the church said it's true, right? It dogmatically. Or how confident are we that Jesus existed and was the Son of God? It's like, well, they're demanding 100% belief, but the argument or that the weight of the evidence is way less than that. And I always analogize it to a courtroom where, whether it's a speeding ticket or a murder case, like both sides are always going to have arguments. Right? If you're on a jury, the other side is always going to have arguments. Right? There's security camera footage of the person doing the crime. Well, what if it's doctored? Right? There's all of these questions. Or you get a speeding ticket, and it's like, well, the radar could have been wrong. It's like, well, the radar was calibrated that day. Well, what if the radar magically was not calibrated for that particular speed assessment? It's like, well, sure, right? That's a possibility, but it's not plausible. And so when I looked back through all these Catholic teachings with like, does the level of belief that we're demanded to have match up to the evidence? The answer was like, no. And so the question was like, so now I can negotiate, I can pick and choose. And in the group that I was a part of, there was no picking or choosing. It was either you believe all the way, or as soon as you're in mortal sin, you are no longer allowed to be part of the or to partake in the sacraments, to be a full participating member. It was like, well, I guess I'm out of here. Because the Catholic Church saying it's infallible is a good salesmanship. It can be helpful to some people, but it does mean that once you think the Catholic Church is wrong on one thing, the apparatus of the Catholic Church is now completely shot and dead in the water.
That's tough. That's a tough thing to go through and to face. But I admire you for, sticking to your guns and making that decision and moving forward in that. I can think to my own experiences and how a few years ago would have been able to pull out all the arguments, all the reasons why Jesus rose from the dead, and all the different arguments as to why morality is an objective truth to the world. And to then have these sort of things that you rely on as sort of, I guess, ground to, like, not necessarily the thing you're staking everything on, but they're kind of like your shield, to then have the ground zero taken away from you, your experiences. It then has you re-looking into the shield, the ground two aspect of the faith, the things that you held to. And I kind of relate to that, where I was looking deeper into these issues and realizing they weren't actually as strong. Like you could probably say that the best explanation, quote unquote, for what happened to what happened in Jerusalem at the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea is that Jesus rose from the dead. Sure, you could say that that's maybe the best explanation, but the amount of devotion and the amount of life-altering change that you have to inhibit and put on and stake on that idea, that it's just kind of maybe the best explanation. And that even just depends upon your worldview. If you think that resurrection is even a possibility, that shifts the whole idea into, well, I'm being asked to do all of these things that I don't necessarily agree with, or maybe don't align with my experiences. And so I can't rest all of my stake on this thing that isn't really even that fully founded. The topic of what we find convincing and what we find unconvincing has to do a lot with that. It has to do with where you're coming from when looking at the facts. And so I find that kind of whole concept to be very fascinating.
I don't think that dogma is a academic endeavor, right? In sciences of any degree, our understandings of nearly every concept have been flipped on their head and updated and changed. And that every position that some academic on botany is going to have, if you had proof, like, you could change their entire worldview, right? Because it's an honest intellectual endeavor. But with an apologist, if some new piece of evidence came out that Jesus was actually an alien and was resurrected and never died, like, you would lose your job if you came to the wrong conclusion, right? And to say that, like, we are 100% confident that Jesus rose from the dead and was fully man and fully God, If it was like, I'm like 8% convinced that's the case, right? That'd be like,
Mhm.
oh, that's a really interesting conversation. If it was like, I think it's more likely that this happened than this didn't happen, it's like, oh, that's like a cool conversation. But when somebody in their ministry, in their creed goes like, I am unequivocally sure that Jesus Christ was fully God, fully man, lived in this way, said these particular things, and this particular story took place, you're like, with 100% confidence based off of evidence from 2,000 years ago, like there's almost no historical idea that I am 100% confident in. And I think that any historian updates and changes their concepts and weighs the evidence according to the likelihood of it happening, where even inside of individual books on ancient Roman emperors, like we can take like, oh, this person existed as plausible, and then the parts of the book that are like, and this emperor did these miracles, it's like, well, we're just not going to weigh that because like statistically speaking, we know that's not going to happen. And we can
Yeah.
like piece our way through historical documents with certain levels of certainty, and then those can be like corroborated with other finds. With the Jesus story, it's just like we are 100% confident. It's like,
Yeah.
brother, I'm 100% confident about nothing. Like every idea that I have out there is open for renegotiation. And that's
Mhm.
what I find dishonest and harmful about dogma, right? The idea of homosexuality. It's like, if somebody
Mhm.
said like, oh, maybe in the first century, because of disease and social things, like we should probably discourage it. But then, like, we know how this works, and our updates or our understandings have updated, and like we know how people can live happy, healthy lives as queer individuals. It's like, cool. Like now we have a new idea. But when you arrive at conversations and you go, no matter what evidence is out there, I will never change my mind. It's like,
Mhm.
you didn't reason your way into this, and you're not going to reason your way out of it. And talking
Yeah.
to a lot of Catholics on homosexuality, like, they have to maintain 100% confidence, and they cannot admit something that would change their mind. Right? Like, what would it take for me to change my mind on my own lifestyle is like a lot of data that this is bad for me, and then I would be celibate again. Right? There are things that would change my mind. But when you're talking to somebody who fundamentally will never change their mind and would not give any hypothetical in which they would change their mind, it's I think the only thing we can call it is dishonest.
I want to push back on that a little bit because I don't think it's necessarily they are actively being dishonest, and maybe that's not what you meant by that.
Yeah.
But what I find is I find it so interesting that people can be so confident in a certain belief or worldview, uh, even though they don't have the evidence or the historical background in order to back it up. And I think it gets to the question of, okay, why are you actually believing this? And you kind of got to this when you were sharing your testimony a bit. You said that you felt sort of like you didn't really relate to people, and then you went to youth group. And in the process of being a part of youth group, being a part of this community, you felt camaraderie, you felt welcomed, and you felt like you were home. And that is a feeling that you cannot deny. And there's no evidence to point you away from the conclusion that, okay, I'm in youth group and youth group is making me feel loved, right? And so I think when we talk about evidence, we have to recognize that there's deeper levels, there's deeper reasons as to why people believe different things. And we can have conversations about like the intellectual like evidence and things of that sort. Um, but everyone coming into this sort of topic is going to interpret the evidence differently based on those preconceived notions, those actual things that happened in their life, which are going to be much more powerful. We look back at previous evidences that we held to be very strong, and the reason we once held them to be very strong is not because they were super solid or super strong, but actually because we had other kind of things in our life that confirmed the evidence. Like my life totally changed, right? Because as soon as I accepted Jesus as my savior. And so that I know is true. And so when I see like the fact that the disciples were all laying their life down for Jesus, and then someone says, well, it wasn't maybe it wasn't all the disciples. Really, maybe it was only James or something along those lines. When I hear something like that, I'm like, well, that doesn't really matter too much because I know deep down, conviction wise, that this is true based on my experiences, and that little evidence just kind of pushes me further in that direction, rather than any sort of skepticism regarding that evidence pushing me away.
Yeah, that
I
is a
wanna-
good clarification. When I say it's a dishonest endeavor, I'm particularly talking to the apologetic class of
Mm.
Christians, where I talk on the internet very differently about religion than I do in person. Because the average person that I talk to about religion is, Jesus changed my life, or I love reading the Quran, or going to the Buddhist temple has changed my life. And that is awesome. Like I don't think that's a sign of deception or a sign of dishonesty. The only time that I start having problems with that is I have read the Quran and it was so beautiful that everything else is wrong. And I'm 100% confident about that. Or with the teachings of the Buddha, they are perfect, they are beyond reproach, and everybody else is wrong. Or with the Christian apologetic class, where they go, not only am I 100% confident in this, but I am 100% confident that your story is also invalid. Because I think with any group that we belong to, and how I look at religion or lack thereof, is the story, is the emotions around it, is that sense of belonging and what we find peace in, I think is what we're all doing. And I think if we admit that, then what has to happen is then every religion or lack thereof is now on equal grounds to be equally valid. Where somebody can go, Jesus saved my life and it was amazing. And also, I am happy that you have read the Quran and like that has changed your life. And that you becoming a secular Buddhist has changed your life around and you've tried the Jesus thing and it didn't work out. Or if the imperative with Jesus is not that he works every time, but that he's worked for me, and if there's an invitation there and if he works for you, that's great. Like that is what most people and most Christians think of. My dishonesty comment is more gauged towards the William Lane Craigs of the world, where you go, I can prove Christianity 100%, and every other religion is wrong, and any other story that involves somebody ending up in a spot that works for them and does not have Jesus is fundamentally wrong in some way. And that when people then start tying their jobs and their ministries toward very specific Christian claims, and that they must uphold those claims regardless of evidence, that is the dishonest endeavor. Not that these people woke up and decided, I want to be dishonest, but they're doing a whole lot of motivated reasoning and deny the fact that they're doing motivated reasoning. Because I think even people, when they're leaving religion, I think it is dishonest to say, I left religion purely over an intellectual argument. I think it is perfectly fine to admit people's experiences of religion and religious people and those cultures into the decisions that they've came to leave religion. But if we go, but that's not valid, then we have to go, then somebody's testimony into religion is valid. And I've always found that like with testimonies, particularly dogmatic or conservative Christians are fine with testimonies with just emotions and no arguments into Christianity, perfectly valid, and they prop them up. But if you've emotioned your way into, you should also be able to emotion your way out of with it with a particular group as well. And I think both directions are perfectly fine. I think my only problem is when somebody goes, Jesus saved me from my depression, so you're going to hell because you don't believe in him. It's like, whoa. Like that is a very different story. And that I like to approach those conversations gently, but for more of the academic and apologetic class of individuals on the internet that should know better. Those are the people that I have no problem calling out as being dishonest.
I think maybe there's still a place in my heart for apologists, where I can understand the fervor, I can understand the deep conviction and the desire for people not to go to hell, right? I can truly see that. And so when I see them sort of be very dogmatic, I don't see that as them necessarily being dishonest or trying to sway people into their way just because they want people to follow them. I see it as in earnest, like, look, I love people, I will love others, and I don't want them to experience eternal torment, which is a rough thing to believe. And so I guess I personally would avoid maybe the word dishonest, but I can respect your use of the word dishonest because I think there is a sense of they're not being fully open-minded, which is true. So, but yeah, I guess that's kind of where I see it. I think I still have a a place in my heart
Yeah.
for apologists in that sense. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't think that they're crazy or that they've woken up and decided to be dishonest. And I don't think that they're generally being dishonest like as individuals. I think that
Okay.
apologetics as a purely academic pursuit is what is dishonest because the field cannot update fundamentally. I know we even talked to people on the very far left who have like motivated reasons to be where they are, and they do dishonest things. And when they make propaganda, it can be dishonest, and also they can be people, and we can understand those motivations. It is more apologetics as this like academic interest that the field, independent of individuals itself, is dishonest. But it doesn't mean that somebody engaged in that field is they themselves entirely dishonest.
I can feel you there. I can
Yeah.
I can agree with you there. Your YouTube channel is called
Mhm.
Gay X Trad,
Mhm.
and your podcast is Intrinsically Ordered. I'm so curious, how did you get to those names?
Yeah, so with the podcast, the Catechism of the Catholic Church was at 2358, whatever the paragraph number is, talks about homosexual identities and ideas being intrinsically disordered. Right, the homosexual orientation is one that is intrinsically disordered because the longing or the impetus cannot be fulfilled from a Platonic sense. So it's then intrinsically ordered is essentially just an inversion of that, which is to say that like you being queer, you being trans, like whatever it is, that is fine and natural, and there is no moral judgment on that.
Yeah.
Now, are there gay people who do bad things? Yes. Are there straight people who do bad things? Like, yes. It's not to say that like all forms of desire are intrinsically ordered, but a message rather for somebody listening when they've been told for their lives that their same-sex attraction is intrinsically disordered to say, oh man, it's intrinsically ordered. Like if you live out this idea of a happy, healthy relationship and being attracted to men, your life will be full of love. It will be full of sacrifice. It will be full of this beautiful life that you can have, even though the church tells you that you cannot have that. And then the main channel with Gay X Trad. Trad is a particular type of Catholic, so you might have a trad cat or a trad Catholic, which is to say like a traditionalist Catholic. And so what I found interesting is that like traditional Catholicism is seen as this like cure to same-sex attraction. That traditionalism has these like strict gender roles and people get to learn them and are very traditional. And then it's like, bro, like I was part of that for a long time, and I'm still gay, and I was a former traditional Catholic, and that seems to in many ways I feel like the Catholic establishment is scared of what I do, and that it's a sort of lab leak where I was part of the groups. I learned all the apologetics. Like I know all of the insider baseball, and now I'm using it and kind of like exposing it. And my goal isn't deconversion, right? Like I don't have a vested interest in whether somebody stays Catholic or Christian or joins another religion or some sort of spirituality or atheism. Like that's not my primary endeavor on YouTube. Isn't like you should leave religion, because I don't think that atheism is for everybody. Because once again, like I don't think atheism like is a worldview. It's weird to like have a worldview that's only defined in not believing somebody else's proposition for a worldview. Like it's unique in that in that realm. And I tell people even when they're coming out, like coming out as whatever is the starting line. Like you coming out as gay like doesn't solve all of your life problems. Like it's not meant to be a positive vision. It's the starting line to being honest with yourself and with the world so that you can build a life. And I don't think that like leaving religion makes your life better. I think in many ways it can get rid of negative elements, but like not being religious isn't a worldview or a way to look at the world or a set of self-help. Where like you leave religion and then you gotta do something with your life. Right? Like simply not being religious doesn't make your life better. I think it's the groundwork to build a better life. Where like me leaving religion finally allowed me to then start dating or to look at the idea of getting married. But like leaving religion didn't give me a husband. Where like it's not like you just like flip these things out. And so what I hope to do in my work is just to give people the tools to critically think about Catholic issues. A lot of Catholic apologetics goes under the radar because it's so complicated and convoluted, and words don't mean what you think they mean when you're talking to these apologists. It's like you have to have been part of the thing to like know how to critique it. And so I think what I hope to do is just to offer a critical voice for dogmatic Catholic positions. And a lot of the creators that I work with and that I support, and a lot of people that support me financially, are still Catholic and are still Christian and are still religious. Like that, my end goal isn't for everybody to drag them out of religion. It's just to go like, yeah, your pastor is giving a homophobic sermon. Like, you can disagree with him and you can still show up, or you can disagree with him and not show up. Like there's so many things that you can do. And so my goal is always just de-radicalization, where even if you maintain the same positions, maybe you can be open to the idea of hearing somebody else's experience with a different religion. Or honestly, hearing somebody who tried Catholicism and it didn't work for them, and they've testimonied their way out of religion, where you can hold the positions that you want. And what I hope that I do in my work on the internet is just allow people to think a little bit more critically, to be a little bit more open to nuance, and then they can decide where they want to go from there. I almost see my work as like reading the terms and conditions of traditional Catholicism. And if you still want to sign up, like go for it, man. Like I'm not saying that the mass is bad or that adoration is dumb. I'm just saying that like you can go and you don't have to believe everything that you're told to believe. But you can come to your own conclusions on how you want to practice and what you want to believe or not to practice or to leave entirely. Those decisions are up to you, and you are the best person to make decisions for your life. Not myself, not the Catholic Church, not some book out there. That like you are the person that gets to make decisions for your life.
You've mentioned that homosexuality is very much so in contention with the Catholic position. It's also very much so in contention just with evangelical and Protestant traditions. Can you explain why is that the case?
There's a few different ways to parse that. One, it's the case because people keep making it the case, but the Catholic Church has updated so many teachings throughout its tradition. And just before this, I was doing a debate on the Bible and homosexuality, where the Bible says a lot of different things about a lot of different things. And even the most conservative individuals in religion have said, like, usury is okay, even though the Bible and the church has historically condemned usury. But our understanding of what usury is has so drastically changed that we develop our doctrines. Or when it comes to...
Can you explain usury? Sorry.
Yeah, so usury is this idea of like charging interest on a loan. And so
Gotcha.
in the Old Testament and in the early church, we didn't live in a capitalist system where usury was essentially a thing where if you couldn't make payments on something, I give you $1,000, and then by the time you can pay me back, I say you got to pay me $2,000. Right? I'm charging interest on charity. And so in Jewish circles, like when they're loaning money to their friends, like they're not allowed to charge interest because, right, like exploiting somebody in a time of need, bad thing. But then in our modern capitalistic system where you take out a mortgage on your house, right, you are paying interest. Or if me as a business owner, if I loan money out to another business owner to like build their business, I'm okay charging interest. Like that is usury. Like all of these things have updated, and our entire economy essentially relies on interest rates and fractional reserve banking. And we go like, hey, when the authors of the Old Testament were condemning usury, they didn't know about fractional reserve banking. And when the early church was condemning like charging interest on your friends in a time of need, they weren't anticipating 401ks as a retirement plan that rely off of speculation in the market. And so we go like, our understanding of what charging interest on loans has so drastically changed that like our teachings do as well. And I think in the same way with homosexuality, in the debate that I was just having, is like how St. Paul understood homosexual activity to be and how the Levitical authors understood homosexuality to be is so thoroughly different. The impetus, the desires, the needs, the practice, and the lived reality of these things are not at all recognizable to a first century author. So we kind of have to make new decisions off of it. And the Catholic Church has brought this tradition of natural law. Evangelicals kind of just like sit on these verses for seemingly no apparent reason, except for kind of looking off of the Catholic lens. There's a lot of different arguments for it. But at the end of the day, we've updated the Bible on slavery, right? God has progressively revealed this thing, and it took people apparently 1700 years to finally figure out that this whole time the Bible was actually anti-slavery, which is like a whole discussion. Like all of these things that we think about the Bible have radically changed over time, according to our modern intuitions and understandings of these things, that we apply some biblical principles to it. And so I think when it comes to homosexuality, if you have the tools to condemn slavery from the Bible, you also have the tools to condemn homophobia and mandatory celibacy from within the Bible.
I think a previous podcast of yours, you were discussing the idea of Paul saying it's better to marry than to burn with passion, right? And that being an allusion to the concept of Paul is recognizing that enforcing celibacy onto people is wrong. It's not something you should be doing, but instead, the idea should be they can be celibate, which would be, in his perspective, better. But if they must get married, then they should get married. And so to use that same sort of logic for a homosexual relationship, it makes a lot of sense.
And I think what people get wrong about this concept is that like the biblical authors were secretly pro-gay. And that's not what a progressive argues. And I'm somebody who's not Christian, so I tend to point people in other sources, but like the case being made isn't that Paul would have been at your local pride celebration, but also like the Levitical authors would have been pro-slavery. Like they wouldn't have been abolitionists. And the first century Christians wouldn't have been freedom fighters in Europe trying to abolish slavery. Right? Like, or when it comes to things like usury or the idea of the church, like all of these big considerations. Like we're not saying that the biblical authors would have been secretly pro-gay this whole time, but Paul seemed to see homosexuality as like something that you caught from doing too much idolatry. Like he says that like when God handed them over to unnatural desires, which is to say that like the Gentiles were doing too much idolatry, God essentially let them fall prey to temptation, and then they started having sex with each other. And that's just not what we understand homosexuality to be now. Paul had no concept of a sexual orientation. Paul had no concept of sex being a consensual two-party thing that people entered into. He seemed obsessed with gender roles and social roles, and then he condemned homosexuality because the person who is being penetrated is giving up their social role and being that of a woman. And it's so utterly foreign to our current understanding. So the only way that we can condemn our current understanding is by having the Bible say something that it didn't say. And same thing being a pro-LGBT document. Like the Bible isn't in of itself, like there's no secret passage that's like, awesome, slay, go to pride. But like what we're doing as a Christian church, generally speaking, is trying to apply biblical concepts and ideas to modern conceptions. Same thing like usury. Like what that is has massively updated, and now our economy relies on it. Same thing with slavery. Like it was in the Old Testament, and then it's like, well, God has progressively revealed it, and then 1700 years after the Bible, we finally figured out that this whole time it was anti-slavery. That took a long time, like this depth charge type of argument, where the people have been reading the Bible for centuries and centuries and centuries, and they didn't come to the conclusion until the 16 and 1700s. Like it's a wild thing to say that like the Bible closes the door to the idea of loving consensual same-sex relationships. And I'm going to make the argument that the Bible would be explicitly for that. All I'm saying is that the Bible has nothing clear to say about the issue and does not meaningfully engage in what we're dealing with now as a modern world.
To me, the question that I think Christians should really wrestle with is, what is salvation for when coming to determining things like the topic of homosexuality in the Bible or church tradition? If a person experiences salvation and yet feels alienation and isolation from God in their practice of that faith, is that what salvation is truly for? As a Christian, I was just concerned with what the Bible said, right? Sola scriptura. But to kind of unwrap the idea of this whole idea of salvation in Jesus, could it potentially not be actually occurring in a certain demographic within the church just because we don't understand what's actually going on?
It seems that they want to have their cake and eat it too, where Jesus is posited as this fulfillment of all desires, that we all have a God-shaped hole in our heart, that to live with God is to live rightly and to live well, and that when we follow biblical principles, our lives get better. Not that they get easier, but that we have peace that surpasses all understanding, that we have life and we have it abundantly, that we hold the commandments of loving God and loving our neighbor above all else, and that to be the glory of God is seeing man fully alive, that type of concept. And both Protestants and Catholics will talk about this concept all the time, that God doesn't create these arbitrary rules. He has this design for our human flourishing, which is like, cool. I think that's a perfectly understandable conclusion to get to. And but they seem to go, well, first we go, what does our church say about these things? And then we say that is good. versus an honest interrogation of the data, which is that mandatory celibacy or living a double life is bad in terms of somebody's psyche, their social relationships, their familial relationships, their spiritual relationships. It is empirically bad on every single level. And so that should be evidence. If we have these grand biblical imperatives towards fulfillment, we should go, wow. Like, if our teaching is unclear and we see one way is a better life and one way is a worse life, then probably the better life is the one that aligns with the gospel. Doesn't seem like a hard argument to make, because they make it on everything, right? The idea of like hottest is modest, or modest is hottest, other direction around. We're like, God's plan for our sexuality is for us to be well integrated. That is for us to live out this biblical love in this spousal love in our marriages, to like bring forth fruit.
When it comes to this idea, though, oftentimes the idea of like homosexuality is almost presented as like you're struggling with this sin, you're struggling with this temptation, and that is not a bad thing, but you should endure it, right? And you should continue to endure. I think it's in Romans 5 where we have Paul talking about, suffering and enduring the suffering to build character. Character builds hope in God, and hope will not lead you to shame and all of that. I think it's in Romans 5. I might be wrong about that. But with this idea of homosexuality, I feel like it might be brought up, the idea that what you really need to do and what will actually help you, it's going to build your character, it's going to build your hope, and it's going to build your relationship with God, is this idea to just suffer it and realize that this is a suffering for the current time, but that eventually you will be placated of the suffering in eternity, and your character will be built because of that. What would you have to say to someone who proposes an idea like that?
I think the answer is like, yeah, God calls us to suffer. But like, it's not like we find suffering and then do more of it. Where I think of, if all we wanted to do was suffer, I can think of a lot of things to do, right? Like, if I put a tone or some sort of like pick underneath my toenail and kick a wall, like that's suffering. And then when somebody goes like, well, God doesn't call us to comfort, he calls us to greatness. Like, it's to push through. It's like, but is there a point here to like me kicking a wall with a toothpick under my toenail, where like suffering is not sufficient to warrant suffering? I think that there are grand biblical plans and great imperatives that do require suffering, like loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek. Those are difficult, but something being difficult does not therefore mean that it's a Christian ideal, right? The Christian ideal isn't like flog yourself or like have your grandma run your feet over with the car. Like, suffering in of itself is not virtuous, is all to say. And so when somebody like tries to explain away homosexuality, like, well, it's suffering and suffering's beautiful, it's like, brother man, I can think of way bigger things to suffer for. So the question becomes, so like, what is God calling us to, right? Like, God would have to be calling us to something to then like warrant suffering, and that being meritorious. And it's like, well, God has a plan for our sexuality. It's like, well, but you're not exactly like using it if you're celibate. But if God has a design for our sexuality, he seems to have run out of SKUs when he reached you, or he seems to have forgotten about you, or like somehow he didn't load the data onto your server, and so you just endlessly fall through life being single, which I don't think that being single is a bad thing. But I think it would be weird to say that like between 3 and 10% of the population, God's design for their sexuality is to not use it at all, ever, and in any circumstance. It's like, that's odd. So like, what is he calling us to? Well, sainthood. And we get to sainthood through suffering. It's like, well, okay, now we're back into like kicking our feet against the wall, or like we're running towards nothing. So like, there has to be, when I think part of the name of the podcast of intrinsically ordered, I think that somebody being attracted to members of the same sex is ordered towards something that is life-giving. I think that to enter into a long-term committed relationship with somebody of the same sex is a beautiful thing. It's something that you have to sacrifice for. It's something that you grow in virtue from. It's something that you have to be careful to not fall into excess with, just like any straight relationship. And I think that in my own experience of falling in love, it has made me nothing but a better person. And falling in love is a difficult thing. And like that desire towards members of the same sex for me is something that invites me to communion. It's something that makes me more alive. It's something that makes me a better person. Like, it is a calling towards something great and something difficult. Everything that we love about heterosexuality is present in homosexuality. That God's design for our life is present there also in homosexuality.
What would you have to say to someone who's struggling with coming out? They're maybe not sure exactly where they line up in terms of their sexual orientation, but they know they're not strictly heterosexual. What would you have to say to someone who's struggling to come out to people around them?
I have a long video on my channel. It's one of my lowest viewed videos, but one of the videos that I am most proud of, and it's like the ultimate coming out guide. And essentially the idea there is, first, with labels, you have to realize that they are descriptive and not prescriptive. That labels are just an approximation of what we're experiencing, that labels can change, labels can be transcended, and that you don't have to find the perfect label. All a label is some sort of way of communicating some sort of experience to people in your life. I know, talking to a lot of straight people, that they've had one or two crushes on members of the same sex in their life. And there are gay people that have had crushes on women once or twice in their life. And there's people who label themselves bisexual, but they're predominantly attracted towards one sex or the other. Or people come out as bi at first, and then they come out as a different label. Like, when you're thinking about your own experience, all coming out is just to be honest with other people in your life with where you're at. It isn't to make this grand prescription about, I have the rest of my life figured out of what it means to be gay. Or I know exactly what I'm going to do if I'm experiencing gender dysphoria. All coming out is to say, like, hey, there are people in my life that I know I can go to when I don't have things figured out. That when I am questioning things. And, like, choose those people carefully. Like, you don't want to come out to the wrong people too soon, right? The people that might kick you out of the house. When you're talking to people in a Christian or a non-Christian context, to come out is to just say, in the same way, when you're like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my career, right? In the same way, when it comes to your sexuality, hey man, I don't know if I'm fully straight. And I felt like maybe you'd be able to help me figure that out, or I just wanted to share that with you, and things are going to change, right? That's all that coming out is. And I also think that coming out isn't about other people. I think coming out is about yourself. It's sort of like clearing the ground or sweeping the minds that are out there. What I mean by that is, before I came out, every time like the topic potentially came up in my head, I was like, how would people react, right? What would this person think? What would that person think? And by the time I thought through what would somebody react to me talking about whatever, like, that thought has passed. And so to come out is to clear the groundwork and to say, I'm not necessarily dating anyone. I'm not necessarily even having sex. It's just to say, like, hey, in the future, I might talk about something related to being gay or to questioning or to attraction or towards these other things or marriage, like whatever it is. And then you get to hear where people are at. And you can figure out, like, who's on your team or who's not on your team. And then you can kind of start living your life. Like, coming out is the starting line. Like I said earlier, like, coming out doesn't make your life amazing. Like, you coming out to your parents as gay doesn't mean you're going to get into the college that you want to get into. You coming out as gay doesn't mean your landlord's not going to charge you rent at the end of the month. Being gay doesn't mean that you're going to find somebody to whom you're attracted and fall in love. But it is a starting line, because I think we can only live life authentically. That when we come out, we get to live lives, that we get to be proud of those lives, that we get to be honest with those lives, that we get to live as ourselves, present in our own bodies, and that we get to move through life. We can be honest about the difficult things about being gay, or the difficult things about pursuing transition, or the difficult things about questioning things. And we can also talk about the great things. We can surround ourselves with a community that knows what that experience is like. We can be honest with people in our lives where they go, hey, I didn't realize, like, my child is gay. Maybe I should read a book on, like, what's that experience like, so that you can be more open with your parents. And then as you go through life, coming out is an ongoing process. That when you start a new job, you come out again. When you go to a new sports league, like, you come out again. Like, coming out is an ongoing process, but it's one that gets easier. Where that first time coming out, I remember I could not say the words I'm gay, and came out via email of all things, because I physically could not say the words. And now I talk about being gay on the internet all the time. Like, coming out is a muscle. It's a strength. It's something that you work on, and that those labels might change. It is a skill and something that you will be proud of doing, even though it is difficult. Right? To borrow the Christian concept of, like, sometimes the things that make our lives better are difficult and that we have to sacrifice for. And I think coming out, being honest with ourselves, being honest with other people, and dealing with the hate and harassment and difficulties and nuance of that is a difficult thing. but is one of the things that I'm most proud of and has allowed me to start living life authentically on my own terms and making better decisions about life. But we're not asking permission to be ourselves. We're just informing people a little bit more about ourselves. And we're the same people after coming out. That when people have known you for years and you're like, well, they still like me. It's like, either you figure out they never liked you to begin with and they only liked a version of you, or you've informed them about a part of your life. That being gay isn't your whole identity, but it is a necessary one to be honest with. And so you're just informing people one more element of who you are, because you're still the same person. Well, I've seen people where once they stop living double lives or they stop living in repression, their lives get better, their lives get healthier, their lives get less crazy, and their lives get very normal and very fulfilling and very boring compared to what they thought it would be.
To me, it speaks to the power of the archetype, the power of the stories we decide to tell, the types of people we decide to prop up. Because that's the story you were telling yourself that you were avoiding, was this rampant sex escapade. And now that you're on the other side of it, you realize there's more stories here. There's more archetypes. And yeah, it's really cool to see that. So.
The thing that always, I think that the average Catholic can fathom the idea of condemning somebody who's living a crazy rock and roll lifestyle. What I think would be really hard for a Catholic to do is to see an older gay couple that have adopted kids that the straight couples wouldn't even take in, that they've built a household of love. And I know so many gay couples that have adopted kids and they've put so many resources into these kids at giving them a life that they would have never had in foster care. And that these couples have been together for decades. They're pillars of their community. They're pillars of their churches. And they are nothing but kind, loving individuals who have made the world a better place. And on their deathbed, when one spouse is passing away, I hope that any Catholic can have some amount of decency and not demand from them a repudiation of the life that they've built with their spouse. But it's easy to condemn the rock and roll. It's really hard to look somebody in the eyes as their spouse is dying. They've been together for decades and they've built a life together and are nothing but pillars of the community, to go like, you have to tell your spouse on their deathbed that everything that you did was sinful. It's like, wow, like that's the hard thing to condemn.
Yeah.
That's where the universal idea of all of it being intrinsically disordered becomes so far from our intuitions, that Catholics rely on this caricature of what it means to be gay or what it means to be trans or all of these things. It's another thing to sit with people who have built nothing but better lives, and better lives than most traditional Catholics out there, and to go, you have to repudiate all of it and condemn your spouse as they're dying. I hope that Catholics can condemn the caricatures, and then when they meet somebody, they can kind of go, maybe I can stop like trying to tell people about this teaching just for this afternoon when I'm in the hospital. I hope Catholics can get to that point.
Well, Cade, I've had a pleasure speaking with you. It has been really great to pick your ear and hear about just all the different things that you are doing. Can you tell the audience how they can learn more about you?
Yeah, so if you search up Cade Bradly on any of the major platforms or the handle @GayXtrad, the X is EX, not just the letter X. I've had a few people type it in that way. You'll see my main channel, and my main channel is much more, they're thought pieces that I've written and rewritten and thought about and dove into. And then I have the second channel, which is my podcast channel, which is just called Intrinsically Ordered, on all platforms, both audio and video versions. And that's where I have a lot of unfiltered conversations. I have conversations with people I don't necessarily agree with in all aspects. And so that's kind of like the marketplace of ideas, versus the main channel are things that I really like to think about. And I only publish there when I'm like, this is something that I'm proud to put out there. And I've thought about this and I think people will like this. That's the main channel. The podcast channel is all sorts of crazy in a good way.
We love crazy. We love crazy.
Yeah.
And then can you explain, do you have any new adventures coming up? Anything the audience can tune into?
I get to, let's see, so we're recording this end of June. In mid-July, I get to go film with a number of Gen Z Catholic apologists doing a big debate format and some vlogs and some longer form conversations. I'll be on a much larger podcast talking with a Gen Z popular or famous Protestant preacher, which should be a blast. And then I have talks with some other bigger names in politics and religion that are either we're looking at dates or in negotiations of what it is that we're going to do. It's fun kind of building the momentum where I've gone from talking to random people in comment sections to now talking to some big names that are out there. I've been on Jubilee twice to debate Jordan Peterson and Michael Knowles. I hope to have future episodes. But I'm only going to stick in my lane. Like there's opinions that I have, and then there's well-formed opinions that I have. And I only want to be on Jubilee talking about the well-formed opinions. So there's nothing on my radar right now with Jubilee. But I know they're casting director, and I know that there will be things in the future that I'll reappear on those. But I like to stick in my lane when it comes to internet commentary. So a number of podcasts, a few Jubilee performances to look forward to. Some collaborations with people that I agree with and disagree with, and just about everything in between.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Cade Bradly. As a reminder, I just launched a TikTok at truth_tradition. If you like this face and want to see more of it, then give it a follow. As always, I'd like to end things off with a quote from sociologist Martha Beck. Basic human contact, the meeting of eyes, the exchanging of words, is to the psyche what oxygen is to the brain. If you're feeling abandoned by the world, interact with anyone that you can. Go, stay curious, and be blessed.